So I wanted to come right out of the gate on the Switch 2 with a fairly measured piece that celebrated the launch lineup and the impressive hardware, while also criticizing Nintendo for the excessively fast turnaround between the April 2nd Direct and the June 5th launch. Then bad news just kept pouring in, steadily dulling my expectations to the point that, spoiler alert, I'm starting to doubt the value proposition of the system altogether, while still, despite the flaws, planning on following through with my pre-order. My feelings about it are complicated to say the least, but let's take some time to really unpack it. This is Little Akiba Games. I'm Patrick. Welcome back to the shop. As great as the last several years have been with the Nintendo Switch, I've always had this sneaking suspicion that Nintendo themselves didn't really understand what makes it such a timeless platform. Apart from my desire to keep the port and remaster train rolling, that's a less surface-level reason for my preference that the Switch had as long a tail as possible. As long as Nintendo was locked to it, they would have no choice but to play to its strengths. That reflects in my Switch library, which just crossed the 200 game mark and may even see 300 before I'm done buying for it. But what exactly do I mean by playing to its strengths? Those of you who have been here long enough might remember a video where I broke down my reasoning for being such a big supporter of Nintendo's 7th console. For its relative lack of power, it also has a relative lack of moving parts compared to the other gaming devices on the market, fewer things that can go wrong, and doesn't even rely on optical media. The more I think about it, the more it reminds me of another device that held a similar place in the market to far less fanfare, the PC Engine. The PC Engine was also an undersized and some would say underpowered console for the era that it occupied, yet its appeal to several gaming niches and its mostly long-lasting hardware, give or take a couple of problematic Duo models, make it a favorite among retro gaming enthusiasts to this day. For a long time, it also enjoyed the distinction of being the budget-friendly retro platform, although with the emergence of devices like the TurboGrafx Mini increasing mainstream awareness of the system, and those like the Analog Duo and the upcoming Retron GX increasing the availability of real hardware, software demand has kind of gotten away from supply, driving prices up. But I digress. With a similar convenience and an appeal to an extremely wide range of gaming tastes, the Switch's legacy won't necessarily be intrinsically associated with the PC Engine in particular, but it will similarly be remembered for decades to come for a lot of the same reasons. People are amassing Switch libraries that can go hundreds of games deep with the assurances that the overwhelming majority of them, all of them if they bought smart, will remain playable on reliable hardware for the long haul, a lot of them at bargain basement prices. Even limited-run games, known for dealing in future holy grails for the Switch, tend to sell their initial releases at around $35 to $40 if you get in on them during their 1-month pre-order period. Outside of these, it's very easy to load up on really good games, even cheaper than those very quickly. A strong Switch library is very easy to amass in very short order if you're willing to look around and step outside the Nintendo first-party sphere. This takes us to the first and arguably the central issue surrounding Switch 2 software uncertainty, the physical media weirdness. As the current understanding goes, Nintendo is only making 2 cartridge specs available to publishers, a new and expensive 64GB cartridge, so new and expensive that it was never once offered on the legacy Switch, and an unspecified low-capacity card generally believed to be 4 or 8GB. This is, of course, moving us toward the keycard debate. As we all know by now, Switch 2 games come in 2 flavors, game cards and key cards. That's a figure of speech. Do not taste your Switch 2 games. They only come in 1 flavor. Bad. This is not necessarily new. Going all the way back to the Switch launch, there have been physical release games that require downloads before they become playable, but the labeling of them has not been at all uniform to this point, nor has the implementation. For example, Hogwarts Legacy is a download-required game that won't even play without the online patch, while Doom and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2 only lock multiplayer behind the download patch, and Star Ocean: The Second Story R only needs internet access for some language packs, but it carries the same labeling. That is what's changing with the Switch 2. Download-required games are being rebranded as game keycards, or just keycards as some people have already taken to calling them, and are all going to hold the entire game on the server side to remove any semblance of ambiguity. When you see the label for a keycard, it will always be along the bottom of the front cover, and you will never have to research what exactly is on the cartridge and what has to be downloaded. None of it is on the cartridge. All of it has to be downloaded. As much of a net negative as this is from a preservation standpoint, I applaud the clarity. I think that's a good thing. The problem is, the apparent lack of choice in Switch 2 cartridge capacity is radically shifting the game card versus key card balance. Where download required games were a rare exception that proved a broader game card rule, we now have a launch lineup primarily comprised of key cards, including games like the Suikoden Collection and Sonic X Shadow Generations that released on the Legacy Switch as game cards with no download required. Friends, we call that a smoking gun. This lineup of keycards includes absolute travesties like the aforementioned, as well as the Switch 2 exclusive Bravely Default HD remaster, which is only available physically as a keycard, albeit with a much more palatable $40 price point. Now, I should note that it's not all terrible news. Cyberpunk 2077 and all of Marvelous's offerings, at least in the West, and there's a lot to discuss on that topic, will release in the form of game cards in their entirety, albeit at the price points of $60 to $70, which is less than ideal. If you want to support complete games on the Switch 2 launch, you are not without options. Things get significantly worse in Japan, where the entire third-party selection on the launch, save for Cyberpunk, comes in the form of keycards, which invites the question, will keycards introduce an element of region locking? What happens when you plug a Japanese keycard into a Switch 2 with a North American account attached to it? Will it be able to find the game at all? If not, that's going to be a brutal blow to the import gaming market, even involving those who don't find keycards to be deal breakers themselves. At the very least, we can now say for absolutely certain that building a library for the Switch 2 is going to be an extremely compromised experience compared to doing so on its predecessor, which pushed me to the edge of not bothering to pre-order one at all. More on this in a moment. Moving on to other topics, GameCube on NSO now exists, which is generally being taken as a good thing. But I find it bittersweet. GameCube ports have been a strong part of the Switch's twilight years, and I've been looking forward to getting more of them on my shelves in the future. How many possible remasters are going to get scuttled in favor of NSO releases now that that's a possibility? How many already may have been? Do I have to give up on my hopes of owning Skies of Arcadia on a cartridge for the first time ever? If so, that's not exactly a trade-off I'm interested in making, even if it does end up being one of the first games added to the service. Not that I think it will be. Another major question I have about GameCube on NSO is that of netcode. Now, I had a theory last year that the secret of online playtest for Switch was related to introducing rollback netcode for GameCube games. And while that did not end up being the case, I don't think GameCube Online play over NSO will be at all palatable without rollback. With fast-paced games like Soul Calibur 2 and F-Zero GX as part of the launch rollout, and even Wave Race Blue Storm, playing them online with the same delay-based netcode that runs on the N64 lineup would be an absolute nightmare. Hopefully Nintendo had the foresight to get out in front of it. F-Zero GX in particular is hard enough to play well even without netplay-induced input lag. As a positive, the pipeline Nintendo put forth for the future of GameCube NSO is absolutely violent toward resellers, and I will always be supportive of anything that hurts resellers. Obviously, I can't talk about Switch 2 introduction gaffes without bringing up the pricing. Now let me be the first to say, I don't actually find the price of the system to be in any way egregious. With tariffs on the table, I was completely prepared to see a $500 price tag on the core system. So a $450 core set with a $500 Mario Kart World bundle is actually a slight relief. Much more controversial is the possibility of $80 games, starting with the retail release of Mario Kart World. I think when The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom launched for $70, it was generally looked at as a preliminary overture to a $70 norm for the Switch 2 in the future. What I don't think any of us considered was that Nintendo would double dip. That they would both ratchet the baseline price for games up to $70 while also reserving the right to tack on the additional $10 on their so-called case-by-case basis, described at the time of Tears of the Kingdom's release. There is simply no excusing that. That is pure greed. Still, the cost of the system itself has been a major point of contention for a lot of people, causing constant calls for Nintendo to lower the price whenever chat is enabled on a Nintendo stream, a practice they would quickly end for that very reason. Exacerbating the problem is Nintendo of America chief Doug Bowser, who, when confronted with the pricing backlash, suggested the Legacy Switch as a suitable product for those who found it to be a problem. This immediately harkened back to one of the biggest pre-launch gaffes in gaming history.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
The context was different, but the dismissive, out-of-touch, let-them-eat-cake spirit of the statement is absolutely identical and disgusting. Don Matrick lost his job over this comment and the circumstances that led to it. Bowser should absolutely share his fate, giving way to someone who can at least deliver a competent message without further fomenting resent in an already pissed-off player base.
And again, at this point, I'm 3 years removed from being president of Nintendo of America. It's been a while. You know, as I read the stories and I read the reports, you know, it struck me that, you know, this isn't the Nintendo that I left.
Dare I hope? Of course, Reggie might be very attached to his retirement and have no desire to step in to help salvage any lost consumer goodwill, and I'd never begrudge him that. Not his circus, not his Donkey Kongs. There's still a part of me that hopes he would at least take the call, if not the offer from Furukawa about taking the helm at Nintendo of America in at least the short term, and maybe bringing a little bit of that Iwata-era temperament to modern-day Nintendo that planted the seeds for the original Switch. I also have to take a moment to call out all the misinformation that surrounded the immediate aftermath of the April Direct, specifically regarding software pricing. There were elements in the gaming press and on social media that latched onto the fact that there was going to be a €10 physical upcharge on Switch 2 games overseas. At least one irresponsible independent outlet, Insider Gaming, ran with the story, applying it presumptively to the North American market and saying with their whole chest that $90 for physical Switch games had been confirmed. I don't know if they were trying to speak something into the narrative or just get a potential scoop on the event that they had been right, but this is the modern-day equivalent of the Spawn Megaton rumor for the real old heads in here, and everyone involved should be blacklisted from the gaming press forever. There's no excuse for that. I also have to take aim at some end users over this, who latched onto the false reports and went to the mat for it, swearing up and down that it was true, despite Insider Gaming's lack of established credibility. And even in the face of retail sites going up reflecting $80 Mario Kart World and $70 Donkey Kong Bonanza price points. If I had to guess, it's not because they actually believed the report in the first place, but because they wanted to keep it in the narrative as long as possible so that the reality would feel like a de-escalation and not the egregious cash grab that it is. As such a narrative would artificially soften the PR blow for Nintendo. Oh, it's just going to be $80 and not $90? Thank goodness! Yeah, no. Now, all negativity aside, and there's plenty to go around, and in the face of pretty much all logic at this point, I'm still going to go ahead with a pre-order because even now, I do still see plenty of benefit to owning a Switch 2. First of all, the Switch 2 is going to be a meaningful generational upgrade over the Switch. That's not something I take for granted, having been through GameCube to Wii, Wii U to Switch, PS4 to PS5, and Xbox One to Xbox Series, all of which either introduced negligible performance improvements at all over their predecessors, or just reserved the visible benefits to people who had the right TVs. The entire April Nintendo Direct just felt like an exhibition of the Switch 2 flexing its hardware over the Switch, and while that's not exactly where my priorities lie, it's nice to see that there will be games possible on this system that simply weren't before. Additionally, as a deeply invested owner of the legacy Switch, I have a massive library of games that can benefit from passive improvements to performance just by virtue of being on better hardware, with or without dedicated Switch 2 editions. Although I'll certainly also be looking forward to seeing the third-party list of Switch 2 edition software when that rolls out. One series I have to imagine will love seeing the inside of a Switch 2 will be Xenoblade Chronicles, which always seems to struggle with its native hardware. One thing I've considered doing over on the Twitch channel is a full series playthrough on Switch 2 hardware to see just what a difference it makes, even or perhaps especially without having Switch 2 editions lined up. Another game I'm looking forward to seeing on the Switch 2 is Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which are already confirmed to be getting Switch 2 editions and desperately need them. I was not as harsh with this game as a lot of people were, and in fact it rekindled my interest in Pokemon for the first time since Gen 4. But I can definitely appreciate the benefit stronger hardware can provide to it, and look forward to seeing that for myself with the free Switch 2 edition upgrade. Hopefully it gives the game a new lease on life altogether. I can see it having maybe the most to gain out of the entire Switch library with this launch, especially if it picks back up with streamers. Finally, another Nintendo console, another Shin'en multimedia racing banger in Fast Fusion. As a bargain, this is the one launch game I know I'm picking up. I've been playing this series since Fast Racing Neo on the Wii U, and while it commits a couple of cardinal sins that get in the way of perfection, the Fast series always makes for good showcase content for your new Nintendo console. The tiny snippet of footage we've gotten of Fusion makes it clear that this one will be no different. But man, I'd sure like more footage to feast on before the game and system arrive on June 5th. One last positive note, it's not launch, probably more of a holiday thing, but there is one game that I'm trying to put all of my hopes into and be as excited about as possible, no matter how close the Switch 2 as we know it remains to the reality, and that is Kirby Air Riders. Nintendo knows how to make a good racing game, and I did not get to play Kirby Air Ride the first time around. Maybe I should try it out on stream sometime soon. If that game gets into the same, oh my god, this is why analog sticks exist energy that made Wave Race 64 devour my soul back in the immediate post-launch months of the Nintendo 64, that would be the best silver lining I could imagine for what has been a really rocky start. That being said, my reasons for pushing forward with a Switch 2 purchase are not altogether in good faith. I am a major proponent of voting with your dollar. And usually that just means buying the products and services you want to support and ignoring the ones you don't. However, the current economic landscape has put Nintendo in a vulnerable position where we have what is, by today's standards, a rare degree of consumer leverage. By all accounts, Nintendo was already selling the Switch 2 at or near a loss at the price point it was announced at, and tariffs will only put Nintendo under more pressure to push software units out the door for every console sold. This is a unique opportunity for us as customers these days. If we buy our Switch 2s but otherwise sit on our hands when it comes to anything we don't like, $80 games, keycards, whatever, we can force Nintendo to meet us where we are in order to prevent us from representing attrition on their attach rates. That is an opportunity I will savor while still continuing to reward the behavior I want to see in the Switch 2 space. It probably goes without saying that I'm long past the point of looking for reasons to get genuinely excited for the system. My June 5th is shaping up to look like me playing a bunch of Fast Fusion, checking out the NSO GameCube stuff, and then jumping into the potential benefits of the new hardware on the extensive Switch library I have amassed in the last few years, with or without the benefit of upgrade patches. At some point during the day I might weigh the pros and cons of simply buying Bravely Default digitally, as much as I'm against the practice outside of extra trustworthy platforms like Steam. $40 isn't a particularly arrogant price point at least. On Steam, or especially GOG, I'd take them up on it in a heartbeat. We'll see. If you have thoughts, let me know down in the comments, especially if you're like-minded. I would love to know your approach to getting some measure of positivity going toward the launch. With all that out of the way, I think I've already abandoned any hope of ever putting together a Switch 2 library that looks anything like what I've accumulated for its predecessor. Prices are far too high, and the selection of game cards will be far too slim for that potential to even exist unless something radical changes. With that in mind, it is perfectly fair to question the future of Patrick on Nintendo as a regular feature on this channel. Patrick on Nintendo was born entirely of my recognition of what the Switch means to preservation, to physical media, to gaming as a whole as an ongoing masterpiece rather than a revolving door of new, usually overproduced, usually overhyped software. If the Switch 2 is a much more standard console in all the worst ways, it will just naturally taper off as a regular feature on this channel. However, I'm not ready to commit to that turn of events just because the Switch 2 and I got off on the wrong foot. I think there's a lot of chaos right now that gaming in general and the Switch 2 in particular are getting caught up in. And I think as the year plays out, we'll know a lot more about the Switch 2's long-term strategy, and Nintendo will have a lot of opportunities to course correct on the worst things hanging over it at the moment. I want to believe in at least that. Failing that, third parties look to be keeping the Switch 1 pipeline stuffed for the foreseeable future, and I will talk about that as long as there's anything to talk about. As preservationists, we might need to go out of our way to keep that era going as long as possible. There's absolutely a turn of events that would see that sentiment become the driving force behind Patrick on Nintendo for at least a couple years to come. Hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. Anyway, that's all for now. Big video, but it stands to reason given how long I was gone. I've said previously that once the Switch 2 was locked in and more fully defined, I'd be right there along with all of you on the road to the launch, but honestly, I was expecting that road to be more of a marathon than the sprint it's shaping up to be. With all of that said, I've got a lot I want to talk about and want to do my damnedest to be optimistic for as much as possible over the next month. If you like this video, then please be sure to like, comment, share, and especially subscribe. Click the notification bell with the all option to know right away when the next video goes up, and as always, do that with all of your favorite channels to make YouTube a better service. I hope to see you back here next time at Little Akiba Games.